June 14th, 1938. Philadelphia Navy Yard, Pennsylvania. The keel of a new warship settled onto the building ways, marking the beginning of something unprecedented in American naval history. USS Washington, hull number BB-56, would become the second ship of the North Carolina class, the first true fast battleships built for the United States Navy in 2 decades. She was born from compromise, shaped by treaty limitations, and destined to prove that American engineering could turn restrictions into advantages. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had ended battleship construction for 15 years, leaving the United States Navy with aging dreadnoughts, while potential adversaries built newer, faster capital ships. When construction finally resumed in the mid-1930s, naval architects faced unprecedented challenges. The Second London Naval Treaty of 1936 imposed strict limitations: 35,000 tons displacement, 14-inch guns maximum. The United States designed North Carolina and Washington accordingly, planning to mount 12 14-inch guns and 3 quadruple turrets. But the treaty contained an escalator clause. If any signatory nation refused to ratify, gun caliber restrictions would increase to 16 inches. Japan, driven by military factions that would have assassinated any diplomat who signed, declined to ratify. The limitation evaporated. American naval architects scrambled to revise their designs. The 14-inch turrets were scrapped before installation. In their place, 9 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns would be mounted in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward, 1 aft. These weapons could fire a 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectile 23 miles with devastating accuracy. They represented the cutting edge of naval gunnery, exceeded in power only by the massive 18-inch guns of Japanese Yamato-class battleships that American intelligence didn't yet know existed. The ship that took shape on the Philadelphia ways over the next 2 years incorporated lessons learned from 2 decades of technological advancement. Washington stretched 728 feet 9 inches from stem to stern, with a beam of 108 feet 4 inches. Her hull form emphasized speed over armor protection. Compared to older battleships, she was designed to steam at 28 knots, fast enough to keep pace with aircraft carriers. 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers fed steam to 4 General Electric turbines, producing 121,000 shaft horsepower. But speed came at a cost. Her armor belt measured only 12 inches at its thickest point, with deck armor ranging from 1.5 to 5.5 inches. By comparison, older battleships like Colorado carried 13-inch belts and 7-inch decks. Washington was designed to fight at longer ranges where her speed and fire control systems would compensate for lighter armor. On June 1, 1940, the completed hull slid down the ways into the Delaware River. Miss Virginia Marshall of Spokane, Washington, a direct descendant of Chief Justice John Marshall, christened the ship as thousands watched the 35,000-ton vessel enter her element for the first time. The third ship to bear the name Washington and the first named for the state rather than the founding father, she would carry the pride of the Pacific Northwest into battle. Fitting out consumed nearly a year. Workers installed the massive gun turrets, each weighing over 1,500 tons, and requiring complex hydraulic and electrical systems. Fire control directors crowned the superstructure sophisticated rangefinders and mechanical computers that would calculate firing solutions accounting for target speed, course range, wind, ship motion, and barrel wear. The secondary battery of 25-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns was installed in 10 twin mounts, capable of engaging both surface targets and aircraft. Captain Howard H. J. Benson assumed command as Washington was commissioned on May 15, 1941. The United States remained officially neutral as war raged across Europe and Asia, but neutrality was becoming increasingly strained. Within 7 months, that pretense would shatter at Pearl Harbor. Washington's shakedown cruise revealed problems typical of first-in-class vessels. The propellers generated severe vibrations at certain speeds, making accurate gunnery nearly impossible and threatening structural damage. Naval engineers tried multiple propeller designs over the following months, seeking the elusive combination of efficiency and smooth operation. None fully solved the problem, though modifications reduced vibrations to acceptable levels. Ensign Robert Williams, assigned to Washington's engineering department during shakedown, We could feel the whole ship shudder at 18 knots. Coffee cups would rattle off tables. The old hands said it was normal for new construction, but it felt like the ship was tearing herself apart. The engineers worked around the clock trying different propeller configurations. More promising was Washington's installation of the latest radar systems. In early 1942, she became one of the first capital ships equipped with fully operational radar, Mark III fire control radar for the main battery, Mark IV sets for the secondary guns, CXM air search radar, and the revolutionary SG surface search radar. This last system would prove decisive in the ship's finest hour, allowing her to fight and win a night surface action against an enemy that couldn't see her until too late. Throughout 1941, Washington conducted training exercises along the eastern seaboard and into the Gulf of Mexico. She operated frequently with her sister ship North Carolina and the new aircraft carrier Hornet, learning the complex coordination required for modern naval warfare. Admiral John W. Wilcox, commander of Battleship Division 6 and Commander Battleship's Atlantic Fleet, flew his flag from Washington's bridge. On December 7, 1941, the news arrived that changed everything. Pearl Harbor burned, the Pacific Fleet's battleship row lay shattered, war had come, and Washington, barely 6 months in commission, would have to fight sooner than anyone expected. But first, she would sail not west toward Japan, but east toward the Arctic, where German battleships threatened the vital convoys carrying American aid to a desperate Soviet Union. March 26, 1942. Portland, Maine. A cold wind cut across the harbor. Washington prepared to sortie as flagship of Task Force 39, bound for the United Kingdom to reinforce the British home fleet. The mission reflected the global nature of the war. America's newest battleship would spend her first combat deployment not hunting Japanese carriers in the Pacific, but deterring German capital ships in the Arctic waters off Norway. Admiral Wilcox stood on Washington's bridge as the task force prepared to depart. With Washington steamed the aircraft carrier Wasp, heavy cruisers Wichita and Tuscaloosa, and a destroyer Screen. Their orders were clear: transit to Scapa Flow in Scotland and operate with the Royal Navy to protect convoys running Lend-Lease supplies to Murmansk in the Soviet Union. The crossing began smoothly, despite heavy seas typical of North Atlantic spring weather. The ships maintained formation, zigzagging to present difficult targets for any German submarines that might detect them. But on March 27th, tragedy struck without enemy action. The man overboard alarm sounded across Washington's communication system. A quick muster revealed the unthinkable. Admiral Wilcox was missing. The heavy cruiser Tuscaloosa maneuvered immediately, dropping life buoys while destroyers began searching Washington's wake through the wind-whipped swells. They found nothing. Admiral John W. Wilcox had either fallen or been washed overboard during the night. His body was never recovered. Command of Task Force 39 passed to Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen, who shifted his flag to Wichita. Washington continued across the Atlantic under the shadow of loss. Commander Thomas H. Binford, Washington's executive officer, later wrote, "Admiral Wilcox was a fine officer and gentleman. To lose him to the sea rather than enemy action felt particularly cruel. The crew was somber for days. We'd sailed for war and suffered our first casualty before firing a shot." The task force reached Scapa Flow in early April. The anchorage, a natural harbor in the Orkney Islands north of Scotland, had served as the Royal Navy's primary fleet base since World War I. Now it sheltered an international force of British, American, and occasionally Free French warships, all dedicated to keeping open the lifeline to Russia. The convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk represented some of the most dangerous naval operations of the war. Merchant ships loaded with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies sailed north around Norway's North Cape, enduring attacks from German U-boats, surface raiders, and land-based aircraft. The presence of powerful German warships, particularly the battleship Tirpitz lurking in Norwegian fjords, forced the Allies to provide heavy escort for each convoy. Washington and Task Force 39 joined the home fleet in late April. Redesignated as Task Force 99 under American operational control, but working in close coordination with British commanders. The strategic calculus was straightforward. If Tirpitz sortied to attack a convoy, Washington would be there to stop her. At 42,000 tons with 8 15-inch guns, Tirpitz was formidable, but outmatched by Washington's 9 16-inch rifles and superior fire control systems. On April 28, Washington and her consorts got underway for convoy protection duty. The mission involved steaming to positions where they could intercept any German surface forces that threatened Allied shipping. The weather was brutal, near freezing temperatures, high seas, frequent storms that made even routine operations dangerous. On May 1st, tragedy struck the formation again, though this time Washington emerged unscathed through a combination of skill and luck. The British battleship King George V, leading the formation, collided in poor visibility with the Tribal-class destroyer HMS Punjabi. The destroyer was cut in two and began sinking immediately, directly in Washington's path. Captain Benson faced a terrible choice. Stopping or maneuvering sharply might cause Washington to ram other ships in the formation. The only option was to proceed ahead at full speed, trying to pass between the two halves of the sinking destroyer before they fouled Washington's screws or damaged her hull. Lieutenant Commander Paul Backus, Washington's navigator, said, "We had seconds to decide." The captain ordered emergency full ahead and straight course. We passed between Punjabi's halves with maybe 50 feet to spare on each side. Then her depth charges started exploding beneath us. The whole ship lifted and shuddered. We thought we'd been torpedoed until we realized what was happening. Those poor British sailors on Punjabi had no time to set their charges to safe. The depth charge explosions, dozens of them detonating at various depths as the destroyer sections sank, created massive underwater concussions that struck Washington's hull like hammer blows. Damage control parties raced through the ship checking for leaks or structural damage. Miraculously, Washington's heavy construction absorbed the punishment. Only minor damage was reported, some buckled plates and sprung rivets that could be repaired without dry docking. But Washington had again experienced loss without accomplishing her primary mission. Through May and into June, the German heavy ships remained in their Norwegian anchorages, declining to sortie against the convoys. Tirpitz, aware of the Allied capital ships waiting to intercept her, stayed safely in Trondheim Fjord, where British and American battleships couldn't reach her without risking devastating air attacks. The operational reality was frustrating. Washington represented enormous striking power, but striking power is useless without targets. The ship spent weeks at sea in miserable conditions, ready to fight a battle that never came. Crew morale suffered from the combination of constant readiness and perpetual inaction. By late June, American naval planners recognized that Washington was needed elsewhere. The Guadalcanal campaign was about to begin in the Solomon Islands. Japanese naval forces dominated the South Pacific. The United States Navy needed every modern capital ship it could spare for the coming battles. On July 7, 1942, Washington departed Scapa Flow bound for the United States. She would never again operate in Atlantic or European waters. The Arctic interlude had taught her crew valuable lessons about operating in terrible weather and maintaining readiness during prolonged deployments. But Washington remained untested in actual combat. That was about to change. The Pacific awaited, and with it, a night battle that would make USS Washington legendary. November 14, 1942, 22:30. The waters north of Guadalcanal. 4 destroyers led the way through darkness broken only by a thin crescent moon. Behind them steamed 2 battleships, South Dakota and Washington, moving at 19 knots toward a battle none of the crews would ever forget. This was Task Force 64, and it represented Admiral William Halsey's last throw of the dice to save Guadalcanal from Japanese recapture. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee stood on Washington's flag bridge, studying radar reports that showed Japanese warships gathering north of Sevo Island. Lee, known throughout the Navy as Ching from his academy days, was the perfect commander for this desperate mission. A former Olympic shooting champion who had won 7 medals, including 5 golds in 1920, Lee possessed an analytical mind, ideally suited to the new age of electronic warfare. He understood radar better than most technicians and trusted it completely. Washington had reached the Pacific in late August after refit and transit through the Panama Canal. She'd joined the South Pacific forces at Noumea, New Caledonia, becoming Lee's flagship for Battleship Division 6. Through September and October, Washington had escorted carriers and covered convoys supporting the Marines fighting ashore on Guadalcanal. But tonight, for the first time, she would fight a surface action. The strategic situation was desperate. For 3 months, American Marines had clung to Henderson Field, the captured Japanese airstrip that gave the Allies air superiority over Guadalcanal by day. But the Japanese owned the night and her darkness. Their fast destroyer runs the Tokyo Express brought reinforcements and supplies, while bombarding American positions. 2 nights earlier, on November 12th and 13th, a chaotic night battle had left dozens of ships damaged or sunk from both sides. The Japanese battleship Hiei had been crippled and finished off by aircraft the next morning, but now another Japanese bombardment force was approaching, led by the battleship Kirishima. Admiral Halsey had thrown together Task Force 64 with whatever ships were available. The 2 battleships had operated together for only a few days. The 4 destroyers, Wakif, Benim, Preston, and Gwyn, came from 4 different destroyer divisions, and had never trained as a unit. It was a scratch force facing veteran Japanese warships that had perfected night combat techniques through 2 years of war. But Lee had advantages the Japanese didn't expect. Washington's SG surface search radar could detect ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles in optimal conditions. Her Mark III fire control radar could track targets and generate accurate firing solutions in complete darkness. The Japanese had primitive radar systems, but nothing approaching American capability. Lee intended to exploit that edge mercilessly. At 23:01, Washington's radar detected multiple contacts rounding the western end of Savo Island. The Japanese were exactly where intelligence had predicted. Lee ordered his destroyers forward while the battleships maintained course south of Savo, positioning themselves to block the Japanese approach to Henderson Field. Admiral Nobutake Kondo's bombardment force significantly outnumbered Lee's task force. The Japanese had the battleship Kirishima, a World War I-era battlecruiser modernized with additional armor, mounting 8 14-inch guns and 4 twin turrets. Heavy cruisers Atago and Takao each carried 10 8-inch guns. Light cruisers Nagara and Sendai led destroyer screens, and 9 destroyers provided additional firepower. Kondo had divided his force into 3 groups, a sweeping unit of light cruisers and destroyers to the east, a screening unit directly ahead of his heavy ships, and his main bombardment unit centered on Kirishima. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had spotted Lee's formation earlier, but misidentified the ships. Some reports described cruisers and destroyers, others mentioned carriers. The confusion meant Kondo didn't realize he faced American battleships until too late. At 23:17, the battle began. Japanese searchlights stabbed through the darkness, illuminating Lee's 4 destroyers as they advanced ahead of the battleships. Within minutes, the night erupted into chaos. Japanese destroyers and cruisers opened fire with devastating accuracy. Long lance torpedoes, the feared oxygen-powered weapons with ranges exceeding 20 miles, streaked through the water. Seaman First Class James Miller, aboard destroyer Walk. The searchlights hit us and we were dead. That's all I remember thinking. We're dead. Then the shells started arriving. The first salvo straddled us, water columns higher than the mast. The second salvo hit. The whole forward part of the ship just exploded. We were sinking before I even understood what was happening. The destroyer slaughter was methodical and terrible. Waka took multiple large-caliber hits and sank within minutes. Preston suffered the same fate, torn apart by cruiser fire and torpedoes. Benham's bow was blown off by a long lance, leaving her crippled and barely able to maintain headway. Only Gwyn escaped serious damage, withdrawing to the south after firing torpedoes that achieved no hits. South Dakota, following Washington, suffered an electrical casualty at the worst possible moment. Circuit breakers tripped throughout the ship, knocking out radar, fire control systems, and communications. Effectively blind, South Dakota inadvertently steamed too close to the Japanese formation while trying to follow Washington through the burning wreckage of the destroyer screen. Japanese searchlights found South Dakota at midnight. Nearly every Japanese ship in the bombardment force shifted fire to this new target, recognizing it as a battleship. Kirishima's 14-inch guns scored at least 3 hits on South Dakota's superstructure, failing to penetrate her heavy belt armor but destroying fire control equipment and starting fires. 5-inch and 8-inch shells from cruisers and destroyers riddled her upper works, killing 39 men and wounding 57 more. Lieutenant Commander William Hank, South Dakota's gunnery officer. We were taking hits from every direction. The ship was staggering under the impacts. Fires everywhere. Communications down. I couldn't coordinate counter-battery fire. We were absorbing tremendous punishment and couldn't effectively fight back. All I could think was that we'd come all this way to die in Ironbottom Sound like everyone else. But while every Japanese gun focused on South Dakota, Washington closed the range undetected. Lee had kept Washington to the west of Savo Island, using the island's bulk to mask his approach on radar. While South Dakota drew enemy fire, Washington's radar tracked Kirishima with cold precision. At 0016 minutes past midnight, Washington opened fire at a range of 8,400 yards. The range was point-blank for battleship combat. Washington's 9 16-inch guns launched 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectiles every 30 seconds. Her 25-inch guns hammered secondary targets, destroyers and cruisers that had no idea Washington was even present. Fire Controlman Second Class Eugene McCarthy, Washington's forward main battery director. We had a perfect radar picture. The computer generated a solution, and the guns trained automatically. I watched the rangefinder and saw the target clearly when the first salvo lit off. 9 orange flames. The shockwave rocked the director and we watched the rounds go downrange. 30 seconds later, the second salvo, then the third. The Japanese didn't even know we were shooting at them for the first 2 salvos. Washington's gunnery was devastatingly accurate. Modern analysis suggests 9 to 20 of her 16-inch shells hit Kirishima, likely closer to 20 based on Japanese damage reports. At 8,000 yards, the 2,700-pound projectiles striking at 2,600 feet per second possessed enormous kinetic energy. They punched through Kirishima's modernized but still inadequate armor like paper. The first hits disabled Kirishima's forward 14-inch turrets, jamming them in train and preventing them from firing. Subsequent hits smashed into her engineering spaces, rupturing steam lines and flooding compartments. A hit below the waterline jammed Kirishima's rudder hard to port, causing her to circle uncontrollably. Fires erupted throughout her superstructure as 5-inch shells, over 100 of them, riddled her upper works. Washington's engagement lasted 7 minutes. In that time, she fired 75 16-inch shells and 107 5-inch rounds. Kirishima, one of Japan's most powerful warships, was reduced to a burning hulk that would sink 3 hours later. Washington also sank the destroyer Ayanami with secondary battery fire and damaged the heavy cruiser Atago. Commander Hideo Nakano, Kirishima's damage control officer, survived the sinking. The American battleship appeared from nowhere. We had no warning. The first we knew of its presence was when the shells began hitting. Massive explosions, one after another. The ship shuddered with each impact. Main battery disabled immediately. Engineering spaces flooding. Rudder jammed. We were helpless. The American shooting was perfect. Every salvo hit. In 7 minutes, we went from combat effective to sinking. There was nothing we could do. Kondo recognized disaster and ordered a general withdrawal. His bombardment mission had failed catastrophically. Instead of shelling Henderson Field and covering the landing of reinforcements, he'd lost a battleship, a destroyer, and suffered damage to multiple cruisers. The Tokyo Express would never again bring battleships or cruisers to Guadalcanal waters. Lee considered pursuing but decided against it. South Dakota was damaged and withdrawing. His destroyer screen was shattered. Japanese destroyer forces still had long lance torpedoes, and Washington, despite her triumph, was not invincible. Lee ordered a zigzag course south, clearing the battle area while Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes that missed in the darkness. As dawn broke on November 15th, the waters off Guadalcanal revealed the night's carnage. 3 American destroyers had been sunk. South Dakota limped toward repairs, but Kirishima was gone, capsized and sunk with 300 men still trapped inside. The Japanese troop convoy that was supposed to land under Kirishima's covering fire turned back, harried by Marine aircraft from Henderson Field. The battle for Guadalcanal's turning point had been reached. USS Washington had accomplished something unprecedented. She was the only American battleship in World War II to sink an enemy battleship in a one-on-one surface engagement. The night battle off Guadalcanal showcased everything modern naval technology could achieve, radar-directed gunnery achieving in 7 minutes what might have taken hours in daylight combat of previous eras. The cost was significant. 242 American sailors died in the battle, most in the 3 destroyers. 249 Japanese died, most entombed in Kirishima's hull. But the strategic result was decisive. Japanese forces would continue fighting for Guadalcanal until February, but they would never again seriously threaten Henderson Field from the sea. Washington had proven her worth. The Mighty Wash, as her crew dubbed her, had lived up to her name. Admiral Halsey signaled his congratulations. "Willis, you have accomplished a magnificent feat." The performance of Task Force 64 was superb, but there was no time for extended celebration. The war in the Pacific was barely a year old, and Washington's fighting had just begun. Admiral Willis Augustus Lee stood barely 5 feet 9 inches tall, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and looked more like a university professor than a warrior. But appearances deceived. Lee was arguably the finest battleship commander in the United States Navy, a man whose intellect and technical mastery transformed complex electronic systems into combat advantages. Born in Natley, Kentucky on May 11, 1888, Lee entered the Naval Academy in 1904. His classmates included future admirals who would shape the Pacific War: Thomas Kincaid, Richmond Kelly Turner, and others. At Annapolis, Lee acquired the nickname Ching, supposedly because his last name sounded vaguely Chinese, and he demonstrated fondness for Far Eastern culture. The name stuck throughout his career. But it was Lee's marksmanship that first brought him fame. In the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium, Lee won 7 medals, 5 gold, 1 silver, 1 bronze in various shooting competitions. He tied with teammate Lloyd Spooner for most medals won at a single Olympics, a record that stood for 60 years. Lee was the most successful athlete at the 1920 Games. Captain Glenn Davis, who served under Lee aboard Washington. The admiral could shoot anything: rifles, pistols, shotguns. He had this incredible eye-hand coordination and the ability to calculate trajectories instinctively. But more importantly, he had an analytical mind that understood systems. He didn't just shoot well, he understood why he shot well, and he could explain it mathematically. That same analytical approach made him brilliant with radar and fire control systems. Through the 1920s and 30s, Lee commanded destroyers, attended the Naval War College, commanded the light cruiser Concord, and served multiple tours in the Fleet Training Division where he helped develop anti-aircraft tactics and procedures. By the time war arrived, Lee was recognized as the Navy's foremost expert on gunnery and fire control. In February 1942, newly promoted to Rear Admiral, Lee became Assistant Chief of Staff to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet. It was a desk job in Washington, D.C., but Lee chafed at administrative duties, while the Pacific Fleet fought desperate battles. He lobbied for sea duty and finally, in August 1942, received orders to take command of Battleship Division 6 in the Pacific. Washington became his flagship, and she would remain so through the crucial campaigns of 1943 and 1944. Lee flew his 2-star flag from her mainmast, and Washington's crew took pride in serving as flagship. The ship's communications facilities were enhanced, additional staff spaces created, and sophisticated radio equipment installed to allow Lee to command multiple battleships simultaneously. Lee's command style emphasized competence over ceremony. He demanded precise gunnery, flawless radar operation, and aggressive but intelligent tactics. He also displayed unusual concern for enlisted sailors' welfare, believing that well-treated crews fought more effectively. Radio Man. First Class Robert Henderson, Washington's Combat Information Center, Admiral Lee would come down to CIC at all hours, sometimes during the middle watch. He'd study the radar displays, talk to the operators about what they were seeing, explain how to interpret returns more effectively. He knew every piece of equipment in that space, understood how it worked, and could troubleshoot technical problems better than the techs. We'd have died for that man. After Guadalcanal, Lee's command expanded. By late November 1942, the battleship North Carolina joined Washington. Together they formed Task Force 64, covering convoys to Guadalcanal and conducting training exercises off Ifari and the New Hebrides. Lee drilled his battleships relentlessly in night combat techniques, determined that the victory at Guadalcanal wouldn't be a one-time lucky strike but rather the foundation for a new way of fighting. On January 4, 1943, Lee's battleships covered transports carrying elements of the 25th Infantry Division to Guadalcanal. Later that month, during the Battle of Rennell Island on January 29th to 30th, Lee's task force was too far south to intervene when Japanese aircraft torpedoed and sank the heavy cruiser Chicago. The battle highlighted the limitations of even powerful surface forces in the face of land-based air attack. By April 1943, Washington departed the South Pacific for Pearl Harbor. She'd been operating continuously for 8 months, with minimal maintenance beyond what could be accomplished at Nouméa's limited facilities. The ship needed a proper overhaul and her crew needed rest. At Pearl Harbor through May and into June, Washington underwent extensive refit. Her anti-aircraft armament was dramatically increased. The 1.1-inch Chicago piano guns that had proven ineffective were replaced with 40mm Bofors guns in quadruple mounts. Additional 20mm Offerflaken cannons were installed throughout the ship. By the time modifications were complete, Washington bristled with close-range anti-aircraft weapons, transforming her into a formidable air defense platform. Lee used the time in Pearl Harbor to conduct intensive training. Washington's crew practiced anti-aircraft drills, damage control exercises, and gunnery training. Lee rotated his officers through all watch stations, ensuring everyone understood not just their own duties but how their responsibilities integrated into the ship's overall combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Hooper, Washington's communications officer. Admiral Lee believed in cross-training. He'd have gunnery officers stand communications watches, engineers stand deck watches, communications officers study fire control system. His philosophy was that in battle, casualties would disrupt normal assignments, and officers had to be able to fill any role. It made us a much more resilient organization. In late June, Washington departed Pearl Harbor for the Central Pacific. The island-hopping campaign was beginning in earnest. The Gilbert Islands would be the first target, followed by the Marshalls, then the Marianas. Lee's battleships would play crucial roles in all these operations, but their missions would be markedly different from the night surface action at Guadalcanal. From this point forward, Washington's primary duty would be screening fast carriers against air attack and providing naval gunfire support for amphibious assaults. It was vital work, but it lacked the dramatic impact of battleship versus battleship combat. Lee would later be offered the opportunity to engage Japanese surface forces during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, but he would decline, believing his battleship force lacked adequate training as a coordinated group for night surface action. That decision would haunt historical analysis for decades. Some criticized Lee for excessive caution. Others praised his realistic assessment of his force's readiness. Lee himself never publicly discussed the decision, but those who knew him understood his reasoning. At Guadalcanal, he'd had days to prepare and drill his force. At Philippine Sea, he would have had hours. Lee refused to gamble with American lives and ships when victory wasn't assured. The Navy promoted Lee to Vice Admiral in 1944 and gave him command of all fast battleships in the Pacific Fleet. Commander Battleship's Pacific Fleet, known as Combat Pack, it was the premier surface command in the Navy, and Lee held it through the final year of the war. On August 25, 1945, just 10 days after Japan's surrender, Vice Admiral Willis Augustus Lee died suddenly of a heart attack while returning to his flagship Wyoming, anchored off Portland, Maine. He was 57 years old. Lee had been assigned to develop defenses against kamikaze attacks, bringing his analytical brilliance to bear on the war's deadliest aerial threat. He died before seeing the fruits of his work. The Navy named the destroyer leader Willis A. Lee, DD-929, later redesignated DL-4, in his honor. But Lee's greatest legacy was the transformation of American battleship tactics from daylight slugging matches to radar-directed night combat. At Guadalcanal, Lee had proven that American technology and training could overcome Japanese numerical superiority and night combat expertise. Washington was his instrument, and together they had changed naval warfare forever. November 1943. The Gilbert Islands. Operation Galvanic. Washington steamed as part of the most powerful naval force assembled in the Pacific War to date. 5 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 12 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 66 destroyers converged on the tiny atolls of Tarawa, Makin, and Apamama. The island-hopping campaign toward Japan's inner defensive perimeter had begun. Lee commanded Task Group 50.8, 6 battleships including Washington, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Indiana, South Dakota, and Alabama. This was the Pacific Fleet's battle line, fast enough to keep pace with carriers yet powerful enough to obliterate any Japanese surface force that might interfere with the amphibious landings. On November 20th, Marines stormed ashore at Tarawa in what would become one of the war's bloodiest battles. Washington and her consorts provided fire support, their 16-inch guns hammering Japanese fortifications on Bideo Island. But the real value of Lee's battleships lay not in shore bombardment, but in their anti-aircraft capability. Japanese air attacks struck the invasion fleet repeatedly, and Washington's expanded anti-aircraft battery proved its worth. Gunners mate Second-Class Thomas Morrison, Washington's Quad 40 mount. The Jap planes came in low and fast, trying to hit the carriers. We threw up a wall of lead 40s and 20s firing simultaneously, tracers crisscrossing like a deadly spiderweb. Saw one Betty bomber fly right into our stream and disintegrate. Another splashed so close alongside the ship we got drenched in spray. The noise was incredible. Constant hammering of the 40s, higher-pitched bark of the 20s, main battery firing shore bombardment salvos that made your ears ring even with protection. After the Gilbert Islands secured in late November, Lee's force received new orders. On December 6th, Task Group 50.8, now comprising all 6 fast battleships plus the carriers Bunker Hill and Monterey, with the 11 destroyer escorts, sortied for Nauru Island, a phosphate-rich speck of land 600 miles west of the Gilberts that Japan had turned into an air base. The bombardment of Nauru on December 8th demonstrated the awesome destructive power of massed battleship firepower. 135 16-inch rounds fell on Japanese installations in a methodical pulverization that left nothing standing. The 6 battleships fired in column formation, each ship engaging specific target areas designated by aerial spotters from their Vought OS-2U Kingfisher floatplanes. The Kingfishers, float-equipped reconnaissance aircraft catapulted from the battleship's fantails, proved invaluable for fire control. Flying at 3,000 feet, spotters could see where shells landed and radio immediate corrections. The system allowed battleships to achieve accuracy impossible with radar alone when bombarding land targets. After Nauru, Washington returned to Pearl Harbor for Christmas 1943. The crew received liberty, the first extended shore leave many had enjoyed in over a year. Pearl Harbor, devastated by the Japanese attack 2 years earlier, was now the bustling hub of the Pacific War. Repair facilities worked around the clock. Supply depots overflowed with equipment. The harbor filled with warships representing American industrial might at full production. January 16, 1944. Washington departed Pearl Harbor as part of Task Force 58, the new designation for the Fast Carrier Task Force. The target was the Marshall Islands, specifically Kwajalein Atoll, the world's largest coral atoll and a key Japanese base. On January 29th, Washington joined Washington BB designation. Confusion was avoided by careful radio procedure in Massachusetts in bombarding Kwajalein's island fortifications. The 3 battleships, escorted by 4 destroyers, approached their firing positions at dawn and opened fire at 0956. The bombardment lasted nearly 5 hours. Washington alone fired over 300 16-inch rounds and 1,500 5-inch shells. The effect on Kwajalein's defenses was catastrophic. Concrete bunkers crumbled under direct hits. Palm trees were shredded to splinters. The once formidable Japanese positions were reduced to smoking craters. Japanese shore batteries attempted to return fire. Several salvos straddled the American battleships, sending up towering water columns. But the Japanese gunners were firing at moving targets 9 to 12,000 yards distant, while American fire control radar allowed precise tracking and adjustment. The duel was hopelessly one-sided. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Thompson, Washington's main battery plot. We could track the Japanese shells on radar as they came in. The plot would call out splashes, short, over, left, right. Our captain maneuvered to avoid patterns, zigzagging while maintaining accurate fire ourselves. The Japanese gunners were brave but outmatched. They kept firing until we destroyed their positions, going down fighting rather than surrendering. The invasion of Kwajalein succeeded with fewer casualties than anticipated, partly because the pre-landing bombardment had been so thorough. Army troops took the main island while Marines seized smaller objectives throughout the atoll. By February 7th, Kwajalein was secured, giving American forces a major fleet anchorage in the Marshalls. But for Washington, the Marshalls campaign would be remembered not for its successful bombardments, but for a disaster that struck in darkness, a collision that would sideline the battleship for 3 critical months. February 1st, 1944, 0420 hours. Southeast of Kwajalein Island. Task Group 58.1 steamed in cruising formation through darkness, conducting post-invasion support operations. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Below Wood, formed the formation's core. 3 battleships, Washington, Indiana, and Massachusetts, provided anti-aircraft screening. 9 destroyers completed the screen. The ships maintained base course 090 degrees at 19 knots, following standard nighttime cruising procedures. Washington served as guide ship, meaning other vessels adjusted their positions relative to her. The destroyer Cogswell was alongside, refueling via hoses stretched between the 2 ships, a delicate operation requiring precise station keeping. Refueling destroyers at night was standard practice, ensuring full anti-submarine screens during daylight hours when Japanese submarine and air attacks were most likely. At 0420, Indiana announced by radio that she was turning left to begin refueling 4 destroyers. Indiana's commanding officer, Captain Alfred Edward Montgomery, intended to slow from 19 to 15 knots and take position astern of the formation where destroyers could come alongside safely. But then Montgomery changed his mind. Based on what he later described as a seaman's eye evaluation of the situation, he decided to turn right instead, toward rather than away from the main formation. This decision, made independently without informing other ships, would prove catastrophic. Indiana came around in a sweeping turn to starboard. Her bow swung toward the formation at increasing speed as her rudder remained hard over. The 45,000-ton battleship was cutting across the formation's track, directly into Washington's path. At 0427, 7 minutes after Indiana began her turn, Washington's officer of the deck spotted Indiana close ahead to port, crossing from left to right. Washington was steaming at 19 knots. Indiana was turning at approximately 20 knots. Her speed temporarily increased by the energy of her turn. Collision was inevitable unless one ship took immediate action. Washington's captain, Glenn B. Davis, had less than 60 seconds to react. He ordered engines to back emergency full and rudder hard left, attempting to swing Washington's bow away from Indiana's path while simultaneously killing forward momentum. Indiana also maneuvered, but the geometry of the situation was unforgiving. In a night collision between battleships, even perfectly executed emergency procedures often fail simply because 45,000-ton vessels cannot stop or turn quickly enough. Ensign Robert Palmer, Washington's junior officer of the deck. I saw Indiana appear out of the darkness, this massive dark shape crossing ahead of us. The captain was giving orders immediately: back full, left full rudder. The collision alarm was sounding throughout the ship. I remember thinking, this can't be happening. We survived Guadalcanal and now we're going to be sunk by our own side in a collision. Time seemed to slow down. I could see we were going to hit and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Approximately 1 minute after Washington spotted Indiana, at 0428, the 2 battleships collided. Washington's bow, reinforced to cut through waves at high speed, scraped down the after portion of Indiana's starboard side like a can opener tearing through sheet metal. The sound was indescribable, metal screaming against metal, rivets popping like rifle shots, deck plates buckling with explosive cracks. Men throughout both ships were thrown off their feet by the impact. Those sleeping were hurled from their bunks. Damage alarms shriek, watertight doors slammed shut automatically as damage control parties scrambled to assess the destruction. For Washington, the damage was catastrophic to her forward structure. Approximately 60 feet of her bow was ground away, crumpled or torn loose. The bow deck 3/4-inch steel plate bent downward and began flapping in the water like a broken wing as the ship continued forward. The collision crushed multiple forward compartments, killing 6 men instantly and injuring dozens more. The forward void spaces began flooding, though watertight doors prevented progressive flooding that might have threatened the ship's stability. Indiana suffered massive damage along her starboard side. Her hull plating from frame 97 to frame 135 was crushed inward, creating a depression several feet deep. The starboard aircraft catapult was torn completely off and fell into the sea. One of her Vought S-2U Kingfisher floatplanes was smashed to wreckage. The after 16-inch gun turret's rangefinder was damaged. Multiple 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft mounts were destroyed. Above and below the waterline, Indiana's starboard side was ripped open across a length of 114 feet. Damage control, then First Class Richard Hayes, Washington's forward repair party. We got down there, and it was bad, really bad. The bow was just gone, twisted metal and flooding compartments. We had casualties in the forward berthing spaces, men trapped or killed by the collision, water coming in through buckled plates. We sealed off everything we could, shored up bulkheads, tried to stabilize the flooding. The ship was taking on water forward and listing to port. I thought we might lose her. 4 men aboard Indiana were killed, 3 by the initial impact, 1 later dying of injuries. 6 men aboard Washington were killed or went missing, never found despite extensive searches. The human cost was tragic, the operational cost severe. Both battleships were immediately withdrawn from combat operations. Indiana, her hull integrity compromised, could not risk further damage that might cause catastrophic flooding. Washington, with her bow destroyed, could not steam at combat speeds without risking further structural failure. Admiral Lee transferred his flag temporarily to another vessel. Indiana proceeded to Majuro Atoll for emergency repairs, then continued to Pearl Harbor. Washington, her damage requiring more extensive work, also headed to Majuro for temporary stabilization before beginning the long transit to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington State for complete reconstruction. The subsequent Court of Inquiry investigated the collision with meticulous attention to every detail. The findings were damning for Indiana's commanding officer. The inquiry concluded that Captain Montgomery had made a series of errors in judgment. He had failed to adequately inform other ships of his maneuvering intentions. He had changed course without ensuring the formation knew of his actions. His decision to turn toward rather than away from the formation was questioned. Most critically, the inquiry found that Montgomery had placed excessive confidence in his ability to judge relative positions and courses by eye rather than relying on radar and proper navigation procedure. Captain Montgomery was relieved of command and never again employed at sea. It was a career-ending failure that resulted from a moment's poor judgment. The Navy treated the collision as a cautionary tale, using it in subsequent training to emphasize the absolute necessity of precise communication and navigation during formation steaming. For Washington, the collision meant missing the most important naval action since Guadalcanal. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, would be fought without her. The invasion of Saipan, the first assault on Japan's inner defensive ring, would proceed with Washington in dry dock thousands of miles away. On February 7th, Washington departed Majuro for Pearl Harbor, arriving February 13th. She was dry docked the next day for temporary repairs that restored basic structural integrity and allowed her to make the transit to Puget Sound. Those repairs consumed until April 7th, when Washington finally departed Pearl Harbor for the West Coast, arriving in Bremerton, Washington on April 26th. The Puget Sound Navy Yard worked around the clock to rebuild Washington's bow. 60 feet of twisted wreckage was cut away. New steel plating was fabricated and welded into place. The destroyed forward compartments were reconstructed. Damaged systems were repaired or replaced. The work consumed 3 months. Washington finally departed Puget Sound on August 1, 1944, rejoining the fleet after 6 months away from combat. She'd missed the Marianas Campaign, Philippine Sea, and the beginning of the liberation of the Philippines. It was a bitter pill for her crew, who knew their absence had come not from enemy action but from a preventable accident. Seaman First Class Donald Wright, reflecting years later, that collision haunted us. We'd proven ourselves at Guadalcanal, done everything right, fought brilliantly. Then we got taken out not by the Japanese but by poor seamanship from another American ship. We sat in dry dock while other battleships fought the biggest carrier battle of the war. Missing that action, it felt like being benched during the championship game because someone on your own team ran into you during warm-ups. But Washington would return to combat. The war was far from over, and the battleship that had saved Guadalcanal would play crucial roles in the war's final campaigns.